Just because you have a mental health challenge, regardless of how bad it may be, you can still live a life that you want to live, and do the things you want to do. Yes, you may have to do it a little bit differently, but you can still do those things you want to do in life. That lived experience knowledge is an actual knowledge set in its own right. It's called experiential knowledge, and it has its own ontological and epistemological positioning. So what we mean by that is it is a form of knowledge, and it has a way of being processed and being used. When we actually start working together in co-production, people actually start to see the value of what lived experience. And when I talk about lived experience, I mean being inclusive of familial lived experience as well, and see the value of what that brings to not just the service design or the service implementation, but also all other facets of how a service works as well. I really do love it. It really gives me a sense of identity, it gives me a sense of hope, it gives me a sense of meaning and purpose in my life, because it actually shows that the 4 or 5 years of absolute crap that I had to deal with, that all of that was for something. And it wasn't just a waste of time in my life.
Welcome to another episode of Peer Journal. Today I'm with Michael J Norton, who I'm going to talk about lived experience research, and I'll ask him to introduce himself. Hi, Michael. How are you?
I'm very good, Neil. Thank you for having me on your program. I'm, as you said, I'm Michael Norton, and currently I'm a PhD student with the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, and I'm also a peer support worker working within Highfield Healthcare in their specialist rehabilitation unit. And I suppose before that, I would have been an engagement and recovery program manager within the HSE, which is the Health Service Executive's Office of Mental Health Engagement and Recovery, an office that's specifically set up to embed recovery-oriented practices into mental health services. And part of that journey is about embedding lived experience roles and the concept of lived experience into a traditionally biomedical system.
So thank you for that introduction. Can you tell me a little bit how you come into this work so we can build a picture?
Yeah, so I came into this work out of my own lived experience of mental health challenges. So between the years of 2011 and 2015, I experienced really bad psychosis. So I heard things that other people could not hear. I saw things that other people could not see. And I believed that I was more powerful, more divine than what I actually am. And I suppose, from there then, from that experience came a fierce, longing to give back and to use my experiences for the better. And I started off in 2015 by volunteering, with the local mental health services. So I went in along with a staff nurse into the acute inpatient setting, and delivered recovery education, very much talking about, discharge, or talking about your admission, your recovery, looking at, mental health, but from a recovery lens. That later led on to more volunteering within peer-led recovery centre, and what we call here consumer panel, or what's now known as a local forum, which is very much a space where people with lived experience of mental health challenges, along with their family and along with service providers, all work together in co-production to really understand what services are, and understand the feelings that might be in services, and also the good things that are in services, and try and support the enhancement of mental health services going forward.
So, by the way, what age are you? So, in what years these things are happening?
Yeah, so in 2011, I was 19 years old. That's when I experienced my first episode of a psychosis. I really started my recovery journey in 2015, and at that point, I was 22 years old. Um, and then around from 22 years old onwards, I've really kind of worked in this space of recovery. Volunteering until about 2017, which would make me about 24 years old. And then after that, working as a peer support worker, firstly for, Psychiatry of Later Life, which looks after people over the age of 65 years that may have a mental health challenge, but also, then after that, working within community, rehab and recovery teams, which look after individuals who have what they call an Axis 1 disorder, but in general sense, it's someone who has, I suppose, experience of hearing things, seeing things, believing things that are not necessarily real, and well, it's real to them, but it's not necessarily real to other people, and not being able to be managed by the community mental health team. So they kind of come into our rehab and recovery services.
Was it like a then specialist service, so to speak? That's what we call or secondary care in the UK.
Yes, exactly. It would be secondary care. It's very much, residential, where people would stay in houses, and they would liaise with their team, throughout their stay in those houses. And they would be different kind of houses. So they'd be kind of tiered. So you'd have your high support houses, which is nurse 24/7, 365 days a year. Then you have your medium support houses, which is very much, I suppose, nurse between 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. And then you have your low supported accommodation, which tend to be, a community nurse pops out about once a day for about half an hour, and that's it. The rest of the time you're on your own, and it's basically a graded tier towards independence, if that makes sense.
Is there an average time? So is it years people live in these houses, or is it months, weeks?
So generally speaking, it can be years. So in the rehab and recovery service that I worked in, we had individuals that were, I suppose, with us since the time of the big asylums. And when the big asylums closed in around the late 2000s, in the years, these individuals were kind of shipped to these rehab and recovery houses. But then, so you have a mixture of those individuals who have been institutionalized from the big asylums, and then you have young people coming in from acute services, and not being able to be managed by a community mental health team at home. So they're brought in for a period of rehabilitation there. Their stays are generally shorter than those who have been, I suppose, with the services since the time of the big asylums. So that's kind of how it works.
Fair enough. Then when did you get into research in mental health about lived experience?
So once again, research has become a really important part of my life, as well as education. I suppose that stemmed from, once again, back from a period when I was really unwell. The one thing that kept me to who I was as a person, the real Michael, was actually reading medical books. So I was the poor little kid who actually, had no friends, but actually read medical books to keep to who he was as a person. That later came out in my recovery, and realizing that it's a very important part. And I suppose thanks to the help of a few individuals within the Irish Mental Health Services, they really encouraged me to explore this side of things. So they got me, I suppose, to write, the co-production, guidance document for the whole HSE. And that really ignited a passion for, learning again and understanding things again, and using my lived experience to actually make something better happen in the world. So that really ignited that piece. And I suppose I've been looking at this the other day. If you look at my publication list, it's like from 2018, there's one publication, 2019, one publication, 2020, there's three, and it keeps going up from there. And I'm kind of like, Michael, do you have a life? But apparently not. Apparently this is my life. This is the way I can give back to the world. And I can show that, just because you have a mental health challenge, regardless of how bad it may be, you can still live a life that you want to live, and do the things you want to do. Yes, you may have to do it a little bit differently, but you can still do those things you want to do in life.
And when it comes to doing things differently, I get a lot of questions from people I work with, as my peers, how people get into lived experience research. Because there's no one way to get to become a peer support worker or peer coach, in where I work. So I'm gonna assume it's as dynamic as it is in the practice when it comes to research.
Definitely. I suppose from my experience, I just slotted in there like a hand going into a glove, really. It just really worked for me. And I suppose, but that, that didn't happen all overnight. There was opportunities that came up over the course of my recovery journey that was like, maybe I could do this, maybe I'd throw my head in the ring and see how that goes. And really that experience started off with somebody needed to write a co-production guidance document. Nobody wanted to do it. So I put my hand up and said I'd do it, and being open to those opportunities, of being involved and having my say in things, and really seeing how my voice and the voice of others with lived experience can really help shape services. So really, the starting point is volunteering, volunteering and showing an interest in the areas that you're volunteering in, and really kind of showing an interest for learning and helping people. That's really how it all started for me. And then once I found my niche, once I found the thing that actually, this actually brings Michael great enjoyment, as well as is something that is productive for the services, then that really just spurred on from there. And I got a name for myself for researching, and 3 books later I'm still here, so it's all good.
Yeah, definitely. So, while you mentioned the books, could you give a kind of a brief rundown of the books? How was that journey? What was your first book about? And then I know what your last book about, but can you give us a brief?
Of course. So, I to date I've written 3 books. I've written 3 books. I've co-edited 1 book. In terms of my first book was on co-production in mental health, looking at implementing policy into practice. And it was very, very random how this idea came about. It was literally, I got a scam email one day saying, why don't you publish a book? And I was like, that actually sounds like a good idea. Let's look into this a bit more. So I reached out to publisher Routledge, and they were more than happy to get involved in the process. So my first book really is on this idea of co-production. And co-production is where people with lived experience of mental health challenges and people who have learnt knowledge come together to help inform and create a deeper understanding of services. So really it's about knowledge sets coming together, fusing together, and then showing a different angle that would be unable to be captured if you just looked at it from a lived experience lens or from a learned knowledge lens. My second book, which is the co-edited book with a good friend of mine who's also a peer support worker, in the services, looked at this idea of recovery, whether you're in mental health, addiction, or dual diagnosis. We all have a recovery journey to follow. And I suppose what we wanted to try and see was, just because you have a mental health challenge, or just because you have an addiction challenge, or just because you have both, what does that recovery journey consist of? And are they actually similar experiences? And what we found was that although everybody's recovery is different, and we've done this by collecting a number of different narratives from people who have had mental health, addiction, or dual diagnosis challenges. And we've done a reflexive thematic analysis, which is very much around getting familiar with the narratives, and then creating codes, and from those codes you create themes, and then you modify those themes into what actually comes out to be the thing. And what we identified was that although these are different experiences, these are different diagnoses, everybody kind of goes through a similar trajectory. So there's that kind of pre-phase of trauma, of either being predisposed to trauma, or actually having a traumatic experience. Then there's this phase of like, I'm feeling really bad, or I really am craving something, and I don't know what to do, and all this kind of stuff. Should I reach out for help? Should I not reach out for help? Then there's that period of reaching out for help, and, were the services actually good? Were they not good? And then after that kind of led to an idea of, or a realization that recovery is something not that services can do for you. It's something that you learn yourself, and you understand that I have to take personal responsibility for me and for my recovery, and therefore these are the steps I'm going to take. And usually when people actually reach that phase, they go on a recovery trajectory that is really positive for them. And then the third book, as you said already, Neil, you understand what this book is, but the third book has been, I suppose, 8 or 9 years in the writing. It's peer support work in mental health services, theory, research, policy, and practice. So in one of my previous jobs, I was an engagement and recovery program lead, and I was the national lead for peer support work, which was a great honor and a great responsibility at the same time, considering that I did come from a peer support background. And I suppose what I'd done with that book was, I used it to meet a need that was in the services at the moment, which was, yes, we have this peer support worker role, and it's a lovely, nice role, but we don't know what that is in services. We don't know how to implement it in services. We don't know whether it is evidence-based or not in services. And therefore, as a result, we have these 4 tiers of theory, research, policy, and practice to demonstrate the actual necessity for peer support work, but also the latest research in relation to peer support work, how policy today backs that up. So for instance, in Irish policy, sharing the vision has recovery as an underpinning principle within the policy document. And then, as we know from the recovery framework that's in Irish mental health services, recovery is achieved through 4 different lenses, or 4 different principles: centrality of lived experience, co-production, organizational commitment, and recovery education. And when you look at the implementation of peer support work, it is about putting the lived experience at the center in everything we do. It is about co-producing services. It is about organizational commitment to creating roles that enhance the recovery for individuals. And it is about recovery education through the use of the lived experience of the peer support worker, so that other people with lived experience can understand and take that on, and realize that, recovery is possible, and learning the steps towards that. So that in essence is why I created the book, and that has been published last year with Routledge. So yeah, it's been a busy few years.
Yeah, I bet it has been. So when it comes to lived experience work being in the center of service design, I'm gonna assume there will be a lot of power dynamics at play, at least in my observation. For reference, I'm working in a community mental health team in London, and I am a peer coach in that team. And we offer 10 one-to-one sessions to people living in that locality if they want to give it a try. Most of the time, it is the first time they are hearing about peer support. It is the first time they are hearing about lived experience practice and actually experiencing it. But also, I have been doing this 8 years, and best recruitment pathway starts with being a service user, in my experience at least. But there is no guidance. As you very well know, the supervision structure is not there. It's very complicated. Most of the time, people who are not peer support workers or lived experience practitioners supervising, and it's a challenge for them as well as the peers. So how is that looking in Ireland? Is it better structured? Do you know much about the structure in the UK? Would you be able to give a comparison?
I suppose we are in Irish services are meeting the very similar challenges as services across the world, which is we want to implement peer support work, but we're meeting all these hierarchical, structural, and governance orientated challenges. So what I mean by that is that it is really I suppose we're trying to implement a role that is based on lived experience as knowledge. But we're trying to implement that in a system that recognizes that learned knowledge and evidence-based practice is key and fundamental to the work of the people that work there. And that in essence is a power struggle. Because sometimes you can have people with learnt knowledge look down on the peer support worker or the individual with lived experience knowledge and question the legitimacy of that knowledge. But I can tell you wholeheartedly here that lived experience knowledge is an actual knowledge set in its own right. It's called experiential knowledge, and it has its own ontological and epistemological positioning. So what we mean by that is it is a form of knowledge, and it has a way of being processed and being used. So the way I like to think about experiential knowledge, it comes really from a feminist perspective, but the way I like to think about it within an ontological and epistemological basis is that ontologically it is an interpretivist piece, because it is an experience that can only be interpreted. And any two people that experience the same experience will interpret that experience in a different way. And that's part of what makes lived experience so powerful. The other element of it is it's socially constructed. So what that means is that your lived experience as a knowledge set is something that is constructed from your experiences in the past, from what you perceive happening now, and then in terms of your other senses, how you feel in that situation, what you smell in that situation, what you feel, what you hear, what you see. It involves these senses. So in other words, that knowledge, that lived experience knowledge, is constructed from all these realms of knowledge, of information, if that makes sense.
Sorry to interrupt you. I want to ask then, why more people don't know about this? Why it is taking so long to recognize it? I mean, in practice, I'm working in a multidisciplinary team, meaning in the team I'm working, there are social workers, psychiatrists, psychologists, mental health nurses, other psychosocial support workers like social prescribers. Psychosocial support is well known to the people who are providing that. But every team I visit or get in touch with, I'm explaining what I do from scratch, and people are interested in it. I'm lucky that I don't come across with a lot of hostile behavior, which happens. It's a reality. But I'm lucky that it hasn't been my experience most of the time. But it is difficult for people to understand. And most importantly, it is also very difficult to understand, therefore, trust for service users. So how do you navigate that, do you think? Why is it not acknowledged in, I don't know, psychiatry or high degree training? People don't hear about it?
So you raise a really interesting question, and it's very much around imbalances of power. So in terms of our not people's knowledge of lived experience, what seems to happen is the rationale behind why some people don't view it as the same as normal as other knowledge, and pretty much looks down on it, is because of their own professional ontological and epistemological positioning. So a psychiatrist, take for example a psychiatrist, they look at numbers from randomized control trials, from clinical studies. They observe a person, and they, from that observation, determine a diagnosis and a course of action for treatment based on their training, and also based on the evidence that is written in the literature around the specific area they're looking at. That notion takes on a positivist positionality, which is very much looks at the world as being objective. Everything in the world is objective. There is only one truth, and that truth is what I observe. In terms of others, and in terms of our role as peers, it's different, because we do not come from a positivist positionality. We do not believe that there is one truth. We do not believe that results can be objectified and a person's life can be objectified. We know from reality, I suppose, that a person's life is not something that can be objectively measured. The way the person feels cannot always be objectively measured. They may have tools that try to do that, but cannot do that. And as such, experiencing a mental health challenge cannot necessarily be objectively measured. You might be able, in some instances, to say, oh, this is depression, and we use the Beck's inventory to measure the severity of depression. But from that, you only recognize, oh, Michael has severe depression. But what does severe depression look like for Michael? How did it come about in Michael's case? How does Michael feel when he is in severe depression? Why does suicidality come into the play in here? What does suicidality look for Michael? These are the questions that a positivist notion cannot dive into, cannot infiltrate. It actually comes from different interpretations that allows us to do that. And I suppose that, I think, is one of the reasons why it's not lived experience as a knowledge is some ways struggling in to gather traction. It's because it's not looked at in terms of, in the same level of rigor and same level of appreciation as the information that you get from a randomized control trial or from a systematic review. So yeah.
Then how can a government or a state can implement this if in a justified way that would make everybody, content with the result?
Well, I think we're starting to do that because of a number of different facets that's come into play. We're starting to do that because of United Nations, UNCOPD, for example. So recognizing that the person have rights and all this kind of stuff. But we're also starting to do that because policy, in its sense, is recognizing that there is more than just one slice that makes the cake. There's many different slices that make the cake. Don't ask me why I'm talking about cake, but I'm talking about cake.
I'm very happy to hear about cake anytime.
But I suppose that's essentially what is happening. And one of the policy kind of pieces I know within an Irish setting is around, we should be working together, everyone working together. And because of that, teams and services had to open up to the idea of, working with people with a different knowledge set. But then through that work, we're starting to recognize that, oh, hold on a second here. The application of a peer within a service is really, really useful. So, for instance, I remember, like, it's only this morning I was at a multidisciplinary team meeting, which is where you have a load of different people from a different, I suppose, groups or different specialities professions, exactly, come together to talk about individual people. And really, they're all talking about different people in different ways. And then I chime in from a lived experience angle, and suddenly everything fits about why this person is acting in a certain way. And that's not possible if you just have a positivist look at things. It's more possible when there is a whole rounded effort, and the co-production of a service actually happens. So I suppose in short, in answering your question, I think we're getting around it because policy is telling us that we need to actually work together to create a recovery oriented service. When we actually start working together in co-production, people actually start to see the value of what lived experience. And when I talk about lived experience, I mean being inclusive of familial lived experience as well, and see the value of what that brings to not just the service design or the service implementation, but also all other facets of how a service works as well.
Is there any evidence base building up for lived experience work that would build that confidence for all roles in making it a truth? Because service users need to believe in it. Other clinicians need to believe in it. We need to believe in it. I mean, most of us do, but practicing it is a different method. It changes day to day how I feel about myself and how I've done. And obviously decision makers, not only policy makers, but decision makers who will make it a reality. I mean, there is billions of policies all around the world. How much of it really goes into practice is another matter. So how do you see that? How do you see the future of lived experience work?
To be honest, I see the future as lived experience work growing and expanding and developing into its own discipline. So I know, for example, today, for instance, this evening at 5 o'clock, I am meeting with a whole bunch of experts of lived experience expertise from various nations from across the world in regards to, putting together a paper that looks at different types of lived experience work and how you go from volunteering to becoming a peer lived experience researcher. So I can see that happening. I've recently been with the help of a good colleague of mine from Norway. We've recently got over the line another book to be looking at lived experience in mental health research and how, and within it I'd be writing a fair bit around its philosophical assumptions to really embed that in play. I think in terms of lived experience, we still have a bit of work to go, especially in the application of lived experience within paid professional roles. So what I mean by that is peer support based roles. I find, I'm not sure what it's like in the UK services, Neil, but in Irish services, I find that we are firefighting a lot of the time. So we may have issues with CAM services, we may have issues with other services that take
I
up
would
all
say
the
the
attention.
same.
Yeah.
I would say the same, but I would say the same for anyone who is working in healthcare.
Yeah.
I would say firefighting is sometimes I see nurses are having a more difficult time than me in the team, definitely. Any social workers, doctors, anybody. Everybody's firefighting.
And I also think you just brought up a really interesting point that actually links back to what we've been discussing earlier, which is why lived experience is not being listened, in some instances, is not being listened to as a knowledge. And that's also because we're also in a service that is very risk orientated and is very much held on the grounds of governance. In other words, if something goes wrong in the morning with patient X, where does the book land? And as a result, we have a service and we have a system that runs on frightening its staff in terms of if something happens, the book lands on you. The book lands on you. Your professional registration is on the line. And therefore, we as a result, we have service providers, well-intentioned service providers, who actually work in a risk-orientated manner rather than it being a proactive and in a manner that actually looks at the risk and says, you know what, we should be positive risk taking here. We should be actually, if the person goes out and does X, Y, and Z while they're out of our care, the responsibility lands on the person, and that's part of recovery as well, is about, taking on ownership for your own recovery, taking on that personal responsibility for my mental health, and the actions that I do as a result of my mental health as well, if that makes sense.
Is there someone in an organization, a person you would like to celebrate, or you would encourage other people to follow? Anyone who inspires you?
That's a really loaded question. There are many people I admire in the lived experience space. Really, I have to go back to a colleague of mine who you just said you've interviewed last week. Michael Ryan is the star of the show, really, in my opinion.
Who chose not to name anyone, just so you know, because of that stress, if I name one person.
Oh my God, but he knows how much I admire him. So, like the man was the first peer support worker, within Irish mental health services. All that time ago in 2012 when we started looking at this idea of peer support. He has written guidance documents in relation to peer support. He's now head of mental health engagement and recovery, really bringing a lived experience angle and lens, and bringing that to things not just at a national level in Irish services, but internationally through lived experience policy making within the World Health Organization itself. He is my boss in a sense. But I do admire him very, 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 very much, and feel that he has made the journey for people with mental health challenges in the Irish setting a little bit better over his time working in the services, and he continues to work in the services to improve it as well.
Okay. Well selected. Also, he's a guest on another episode, so please keep listening or watching wherever you found us. How about hope? Let's talk about hope. How do we hold hope? Where do you find hope when you need it?
That's a really good question. Hope for me is a very, very important concept. It is something that I try and bring to the people I work with every day. Even when they're in the darkest of situations, I try and show that you can go out the other side and you can live a life that you want to live. I think for me in my own personal life, what gives me hope is number one, the work I do, the research I do. I would, if you think I do the research because I get paid to do the research, there's no money in research. So you do it because you love it. And in my occasion, I really do love it. It really gives me a sense of identity, it gives me a sense of hope, it gives me a sense of meaning and purpose in my life, because it actually shows that the 4 or 5 years of absolute crap that I had to deal with, that all of that was for something. And it wasn't just a waste of time in my life. I think as well, what also gives me hope is my family. My mum is a great source of hope. Anytime I feel down or I feel stressed or I think, you know what, maybe I'm not good enough to do this PhD, or maybe I'm not good enough to do other things, my mum is always first to say, Michael, cop on, look what you've achieved already. And she gives me that hope in that sense. I suppose another person that gives me hope. And I know she's way too young to be listening to this at the moment, but she's my little niece and my goddaughter, Sophie. And she came into our life at a period of really hard time for our family, because of addiction challenges, with my brother. But she's literally a little ray of sunshine. She brings joy to my life. Every time I see her, I give her a big hug. She always gives me the best hugs. And I'm really, I do a lot of what I do now in the hopes that she will never, ever, ever have to come through what I had to go through. But if she does, that there is that little bit of ray of sunshine at the end saying, you know what, if Michael, your uncle, can do it, then you can do it too.
A great place to end. But before we do, I have final question, which is, have you got any questions for me, Michael?
So Neil, after spending the last half an hour or so talking about lived experience and what it means to me as both an individual with lived experience and also as a researcher who writes about lived experience. But I would like to ask you in return, what does lived experience mean to you?
At this point in life, it means the life itself and livelihood, because now I have been doing it for 8 years. But when my friends learned what was my latest job was, they said, oh, brilliant, you have been doing it all your life and now someone is paying you. That's great. From a very young age, I was obsessed with finding my calling. I don't know why. I don't know if I saw it in a film. And for a long time, until from the age of 10 to 18, I dreamed about being an actress. It wasn't for me, but I didn't know that back then. And then when I didn't get into art school in Turkey, but I got into the best university, and I wasn't happy because it wasn't the school I wanted. I felt really lost for a long time. So when I found lived experience work totally by coincidence, it was like a new lease of life. I found it in the darkest period of my life. And it became the recovery journey of myself as well as other people. I am still going through this recovery thanks to people I work with. So because it was magical that all the things you named as a problem, as a challenge, as something to get rid of, becomes an expertise overnight. Obviously, it doesn't come overnight, but in my conscious, when I learned about this work, oh my God, I can make something of my challenges and I can support other people and I can keep living. Yes, I am okay to live like this. Because someone who wrote a couple of lines in one of the events, I'm very sorry, I don't remember who gave me that note, but it was from a poem by Dar Williams called After All. And it says, and when I chose to live, there was no joy. It's just a line I crossed. So that's where I was when I found lived experience. And then life became more. So that's what it means to me.
Awesome.
Thank you for asking.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our viewers and listeners, and Michael, of course, and hope to see you at another episode.